Good evening and welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those just joining the show for the first time, my name is Irina Zuckerman. I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is our special guest, Richard Sassoon, who brings together a unique background of skills and experiences in the financial sector, a legal background, as well as a scholarly background in history and languages of the Middle East. Richard, welcome to the Washington Outsider Report. Before we dive into today's topic, the reorientation of the Middle East and the breakdown or apparent breakdown of the alliance with the United States, I'd like to ask Richard about his background and how he came to specialize in this area and have such a broad level of depth in studying Middle East history, culture, and having the understanding of current events as well.
As it may, my interest in the region came from my upbringing. I am an Iraqi Jew by heritage, American by citizenship and birth, and I've always felt that I understand the Middle East in a way that most Americans don't understand it, and that I always felt that my value add in any kind of discussion about world or geopolitics was what I could say about Middle Eastern perspectives, Middle Eastern identities, and Middle Eastern understandings of what's going on in today's day and age. To that end, for example, I have a series on Middle Eastern history tracing from Muhammad all the way up to the 19th century, where I meet once a week. The contact details Irina has. And I thought that this would be a really great forum to sort of talk about where those perspectives and those ideas clash with modern intuitions and changes in global policies.
Today, we are seeing a shift, a geopolitical change in dynamics that may transform U.S. relationship with the entire region for the foreseeable future in ways that will make it potentially quite complicated for the U.S. to relate to its partners in the same way as before. This is a result of decades of policies that ended up heading in an increasingly failed direction, one might say. I brought up the issue of reorientation because we are seeing how the countries and groups that had been US allies against the Soviet Union, against communism during the Cold War, are now realigning with the communist China and with Russia, which is not, although not strictly speaking, communist, is extremely anti-Western, imperialist, and led by someone who spent the first part of his career in the KGB, with everything that ensues from there. The reasons for this shift are many, but we are going to focus on the relations with the US specifically today. And what I wanted to ask you is how there are many contributing factors to all of this, but what, in your opinion, is the most decisive point that drove the situation to where we are today before we start discussing specific cases and situations?
So to start off, I should lay my cards out on the table. I tend to be very much in favor of intervention, both economic, political, and military in foreign regions. So I think that the clearest reason for the shift in policy between the historic Israel-Sunni alliance that the United States has tried to broker, and we'll discuss that probably more as we get into this conversation, and the current situation where we have we have the states in the Israel-Sunni alliance generally bucking the trend with the United States trying to maintain a balance between the United States and Russia, has to do with the United States withdrawal from the region. We've seen with two past presidents, Obama and Trump, that the United States presence in the Middle East is not the same as it once was. In particular, when it comes to Biden, the Israel-Sunni alliance has generally felt that his perception of the Middle East and his orientation in terms of goals and desires was more in favor of Iran than it was in favor of the Israel-Sunni alliance, in particularly the negotiation of the JCPOA. When it comes to Trump, and a failure to protect US allies in the region, we saw that in particular with the way that Trump abandoned the Kurds in northern Syria. And so we see from a president that, at least to the Middle Eastern partners, appeared hostile to the interests of the Israel-Sunni alliance, and a secondary president who was completely uninterested in the situation in the Middle East, that the Middle Eastern states of the Israel-Sunni alliance have decided that their orientation should be much more about their own benefit in the region and the power players who will remain in the region than it will be towards the United States. And just for clarity, when I say the Israel-Sunni alliance, I'm referring to Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states like United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan, Israel, in the Levant region.
Now, here's my question. On the one hand, it is completely correct to say that Biden single-handedly has done a lot of damage in the past year, with plus year plus change since coming to office. He has single-mindedly focused on the Iran deal to the exclusion of other concerns, and has done a great deal of damage in terms of that relationship. On the other hand, I think it's also fair to say that Russia and China, their presence in the region and their relationship with these states has been until recently ostensibly short-term and tactical in terms of what particular Russia had to offer. And China might be a little bit different, but this dilemma that instead of looking for partners like India that at least are somewhat cautious about dealing with Iran, they have a relationship, but they do not fully and full-heartedly embrace it, or other growing powers. These countries are turning to the very states that are enabling their worst enemy and the very country that they are upset about US supporting.
Sure. That's a really great question. I think that in particular, when it comes to India, India doesn't have much of a footprint in the Middle East, relatively speaking. They're not trying to build bases. They're not sending their military in terms of an important player in the region. Russia, through its war in Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020, China with its increased creation of military facilities and technologies that it can provide throughout the Middle East and in the United States completely. The United States is still the source of the majority of their weapons, a key vote on the UN Security Council. They don't want to, they're willing to take advantage of the presence of those players to the extent that they're making their offerings present.
Now, the irony in all of this is that the Biden administration in particular has emphasized democracy, human rights, and multilateralism when trying to enter office. Yet, its policy has driven away allies. It has embraced Iran without consulting or involving the Sunni Arab states or Israel for that matter. And moreover, by allowing China and Russia to step into this country, it's allowing two of the human rights abusive, non-democratic states that are also purveyors of surveillance technology of the most damaging kinds, not just technologies, but entire societies and social order focused on the rise of surveillance states, combinations that if you're already concerned about some level of authoritarianism or some crackdown on freedoms of speech and the like, can around the world.
To be fair, prior to 1990, this was the United States' general policy in the Cold War. It was ruled it was less important than whether or not they were US aligned. And I believe that as we're moving towards a more multipolar system, a system where the United States is not the single dominant player, and that a country is aligned with the United States and its objectives, than it is that it, strictly speaking, is a democracy. And we're seeing that in United States relations with a number of different countries around the world. where the human rights concerns are giving way because spheres of influence.
Well, all of that may very well be true, but yet that still doesn't explain the contradictions in US policy, which with Biden and other Democrats having attacked some of the Gulf states on these issues, while aligned quite the opposite. In fact, all three are openly anti-Western. So if the US is more concerned about alliance and not really concerned about human rights, democracy, and whatever, why on earth would it be enabling the countries that are both anti-democratic and also not aligned with the US and discarding the countries that whatever their shortcomings have in fact been aligned with the US?
I actually don't agree with the presupposition in the question. If we look at the sanctions regime that the United States has implemented under Obama, Trump, and Biden, it's become increasingly difficult for individuals in countries that are Russia or China aligned to do business. And so that's a much more salient form of critique than harsh words that may have been exchanged, for example, between Biden and the Saudi government concerning the death of a particular journalist. And other strong words about perhaps the Emir of Dubai and his family. But I see that from a functional perspective, while there may be harsher words for our allies in the Israel-Sunni alliance, there are actual harsher actions that make it very difficult for businesses to operate from Belarus to Russia, to China, and other countries and Iran and other countries in their orbit because of these direct sanctions.
Now, the other issue that some of these allies have complained about, aside from the language used, the negative publicity, and the apparent public embarrassment from US treatment at all levels, has been the abandonment of their security concerns and interests, such as the failure to provide sufficient support for the fight against the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen, especially given their recent attacks. And in fact, US withdrew weapons from Saudi Arabia in the midst of a barrage of attacks last summer. Why would the administration do that, especially given that some of these conflicts are also a threat to the US? With the globalization of terrorism and globalization of extremist ideology, it's not like these conflicts can be fully isolated or not touch on US interests at all anyway.
Sure. With regards to the Houthis, it's a little difficult for me to come to a conclusion. My intuition here is, strictly speaking, that the Yemeni famines that have resulted that have come out of the Yemeni civil war, whether the Houthis are responsible or those that oppose them are, those famines have a lot more weight on the humanitarian concern, and that's primarily, at least as far as I'm aware, the U.S. objection to supporting Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates' military presence in the north of Yemen to deal with the Houthi rebels. To the degree that Shiite Islamism and jihadism is an international threat, I completely agree with you. It just happens to not be one targeted at the United States. And so I feel that for the most part, the United States' sympathies are not as acutely attuned as they are to specific organizations like Al-Qaeda, like Daesh or Islamic State, whose interests were directly operating in contra to United States.
While Houthis may not yet be a direct threat to the US, specifically Iran, in fact, it has abducted US citizens and permanent residents. It has attempted operations on US soil, and it continues to threaten US in particular in a variety of different ways. And yet we are seeing that the terms of the deal that is now being discussed, leaving aside all other considerations about allies and their role in all of this, US direct security of the US itself proper seems to be taking a backstage to other considerations. What, in your opinion, are those considerations? It's hard to imagine that Rob Malley or anyone else in the administration is not familiar with IAEA reports on Iran cheating from the first days of GCPOA. that they are not familiar with the Iranian methods in negotiations or intelligence reports about the intent to continue the nuclear program that have been widely publicized. So, what is driving this willingness to give up US security concerns, such as willingness to refuse to negotiate the status of the hostages or the fact that Iranians planned abduction operations on US soil, given that the outcome in this alleged deal is not likely to ever be what Biden hopes for to achieve. It's pretty obvious. It's been confirmed on experts by Democrats and Republicans alike, and a lot of people in Congress feel the same way.
Sure. My intuition about why the United States is not taking these kinds of concerns as seriously as perhaps it should is that the United States government is worried about the isolationist bent within the US population. The isolationism has been growing as a phenomenon within the United States, especially during and prior to a little bit the Trump years. And I believe that Biden doesn't believe he has the political capital, given that he's not a terribly charismatic politician, to bring America into what either could be the beginnings of an international conflict or really deal with what seem like ancillary security concerns to the average American.
So, in other words, Biden really has no idea how to handle Iran outside of this, and is just looking to kick the can down the road to somebody else through this temporary measure, knowing full well that it's not going to work.
I don't know if he knows full well it's not going to work. The rest of your statement, I agree with you. My intuition here is that Biden was specifically elected by the majority of the American electorate because he would do nothing on everything. I think that all of us can remember talking to friends on either side of the aisle about why they were voting for Biden, and very few people can say anything positive that would vote for Biden. In every case, my case included, I voted for Biden. The reason I did was specifically because he was not the other candidate. And the entire mandate that Biden ran on was effectively that. He had very few campaign speeches, no clear agenda. You could find one on his website, but to the extent that it was delineated or had any promising vision of the future, it was practically devoid of content. And my intuition is that the Democratic Party at this point doesn't have a clear vision of what the future should be. To be fair, the Republican Party doesn't have a clear vision of what the future should be either. Their visions, at least at this present moment, both the Democrats and the Republicans, are to do whatever the other party doesn't want me to do, more so than actually demonstrate where Americans can be. And without that level of charisma, without that level of perseverance as president, you're not going to create a will of the people from the top down, as some presidents have had the ability to do. Andrew Jackson is a perfect example of that kind of president. FDR and Teddy Roosevelt are examples of that kind of president who from the top down created a will of the American people that through their charismatic character was able to transcend. Biden is simply not capable of this. And I honestly don't think he's interested in becoming capable of doing this.
Why would that be the case? Why won't the party take the time to formulate a concrete vision, even if Biden himself is not that sort of a leader or was basically forced into that role for whatever political reason? Why would the party apparatus behind him want nothing more than squabbling over deals that will not improve anyone's future in the particular, or formulate an incoherent foreign policy that backfires at every turn, to the point that US has had to backtrack on multiple occasions all over on policies all over the world?
I'm a believer in organizational theory, which is the idea that any singular group or organization doesn't have one consistent or coherent rationale for pursuing any objective. The objectives actually come down from the individuals in that organization fighting. And so what you end up with is some sort of compromise intent. And I think that's exactly what's going on in the Democratic Party at this moment, especially as regards foreign policy, which is one of the areas that they're least concerned with in general, right? They're much more concerned with welfare projects and education and things along those lines. So what ends up coming out is we don't want to offend anybody who could possibly use foreign policy to vote for the other person. So we're not going to do anything that's interesting, nuanced, transformative, or developed because that's the one agreement that everybody in the party can get behind, be it the progressives who would want to have a more, for example, pro-Palestinian, pro-Iranian policy in the US government, to the more conservative members of the Democratic Party, of which Biden was historically one, who want to maintain a strong alliance with the Israel-Sunni alliance. So you end up with this pastiche policy of let's not do anything and let's hope that everything goes well, which is a policy that's going to fail consistently because the world is changing.
I'm hearing from all over the world, and in particular from the Middle East, who has been overall the most outspoken out of all the global dissatisfied parties with the current state of US affairs, that they simply cannot trust US, not because of any specific just policies, but because of the level of polarization and the rapid turnaround in policy every 4 to 8 years, depending on the administration. The party politics issue is not new to the United States, but the extreme dissolution of bipartisanship, specifically on Iran issue, and the move away of this traditional Sunni alliance and being pro-Israel has been something that has emerged specifically under Obama administration and has grown ever since. There was some level of a great deal of dissatisfaction with Bush's war in Iraq, but not enough to completely undermine the relationships overall. But starting with Obama, we are seeing rapid shifts in the US and escalation of party splits on some of these issues. What do you think caused the sudden change? Is there any way to overcome it? And what should be the argument to these countries? US cannot stop being, bipartisan country. It's not going to turn into a stable monarchy because we don't want a monarchy. It's not going to be like them. How can we continue making an argument for why we should be their primary partner if this is a real issue?
Sure, there are a lot of different components here. The first thing is that I would say that throughout the Cold War, regardless of whether the president was a Democrat or Republican, the presidents didn't interfere with a great amount of weight in the actions of the CIA, of the Foreign Service, of the Department of State, and the various executive organs that are responsible for maintaining diplomatic relations with our neighboring states. So whether the administration was a Republicans like Reagan's or a Democrats like Carter's, generally speaking, our Middle Eastern allies could expect the same people in the State Department, the same individuals in the CIA, to be responsible for running operations and for creating a consistent form of policy. As the Cold War ended and you began to have increasing access to information, especially among the population, I believe that a lot of what the deep state was doing, and by deep state, I mean all of these different entities, right? The CIA, the Department of State, the Foreign Service, came under much more scrutiny, similar to the way that when videography came back from the Vietnam War, it put the Vietnam War under much more scrutiny than the Korean War had been, despite the fact that the Korean War was actually much bloodier than the war in Vietnam. Because the war in Vietnam was televised, it made that shock much more real. And I think WikiLeaks and the discussion of the deep state in the public arena, especially on social media, really thrust the deep state into a level of examination that it was not prepared for, and it couldn't actually deal with. Under both Obama and Trump, the deep state was targeted by the executive. Obama targeted it by primarily not listening to the advice of its chief leaders, especially those in the Department of State. And Trump targeted it by literally firing its members. And so you lost that level of continuity across the various administrations in dealing with the Middle East. And so since the president now has much more of a voice in creating international policy, and the senators and Congress people have much more say in creating US policy, we're seeing a lot more division because the United States population was never uniformly in favor of the US acts during the Cold War. It simply just wasn't aware of them or to the extent in which they operated. So I would say that it's actually the democratization of information has led to a democratization in policy. And that goes back to the organizational theory, where you end up with a pastiche policy, which is not useful to anybody. And that's exactly what the Middle Eastern leaders in the Israel-Sunni alliance are reacting to. Before they could rely on consistent actions from the United States, and now the actions of the United States, to the extent they exist, are inconsistent and unhelpful.
It's funny because traditionally a lot of these career officials, whether in foreign service or in any other agency, came from kind of more left-leaning democratic backgrounds. Arguably, over the decades, some of the institutions that produced these individuals have become increasingly more progressive, leftist, whatever you want to say. That has impacted the way these individuals conducted their own policy. So perhaps 30, 40 years ago, deep state was just a bunch of career bureaucrats doing their thing, but over time they became increasingly activist in favor of particular agenda. How is a president supposed to deal with that issue, particularly a president that wants to have his own policy and a group of ideologues stands in the way? I mean, this creates a real conflict, and that sort of conflict also presents itself as a dilemma to the outside world, including US allies watching this messy situation playing out.
Sure, but I would say that the phrasing that you have is the exact opposite. It's that the ideologues have been running the show, and now the presidents are trying to insert themselves in the process, right? So you have this weird situation where people who are knowledgeable about a specific set of issues have made it their entire life's goal to understand how taxes rise in Yemen, for want of a better term, right? And the president, who is typically not schooled in those specific matters, may have read a dossier about 15 minutes before meeting with that official to have some sort of idea what's going on, is proceeding to then tell him how to operate it, which, to be fair, this is a democratization of the policy. It is returning what was originally a bureaucratic function to an elected function. So from the perspective of democracy, this is a win. From the perspective of a consistent and coherent policy, it's a loss. And I would argue, and perhaps this might be a point of difference between you and I, that the university education and the activist making was really not that strongly felt within the State Department and the CIA, because those organizations are still run by many of the same people who were in that organization 30, 40 years ago. So it's those people, of course, at that time were not leading the organization. They were in the organization, but not leading it. Now, a lot of those people, because they've been removed by Trump, it's a whole new generation of State Department officials who have less experience and are more aligned with whichever president has promoted them to the position that they have. But my argument would be that the derangement of US Middle Eastern policy has much more to do with executive interference with the deep state than it does with any long-term change within the ideological politics of the deep state.
So while there is certainly an issue to consider with the very process of making US policy, there's the second issue that is of no less importance, which is communicating that policy to the allies. Whatever the case may be, and whatever the policy may be, it is very clear that if you have a clear line of communication, even if your allies disagree, they still may make appropriate arrangements as long as you're on the same page with regards to what is about transpiring. We have seen the erasure of simple connections and ability to discuss matters from the highest level to secondary official level, in particular even between Israel, one of U.S. closest allies, but also between Arab states. What happened? What exactly caused the rift in just simple ability to discuss matters without virtue signaling, causing embarrassment, and just talking past each other?
To the extent that we have virtue signaling, that has a lot more to do with American pop culture than it does with any sort of political agenda, at least to my eyes. Unfortunately, the culture does affect the way that politicians have to demonstrate themselves and appear to be non-biased. So that I agree with you that it harms communication. I'm not sure what the way would be to restore those kinds of communicative ties beyond using back channels more often than media get-togethers where a U.S. representative will be forced to say something less than flattering about the country with whom he's meeting.
I am seeing, however, and I don't want to go into specifics, but I'm seeing a breakdown even in back channel communications to the extent that I have seen countries rely on back channel efforts to communicate their issues. Traditional personal relationships have seemed to vanish or not to carry much importance. Lobbying efforts have resulted in very little because the lobbying process has become essentially a one-way street and somewhat corrupted, not so much by the countries in question, but by the lobbies themselves and their lack of initiative and just plain ineffectuality. And for whatever reason, there just seems to be no way to transmit the message effectively back and forth. There seems to be a chaotic unwillingness to listen to the other perspectives and come up with some way of communicating that would show empathy and concern for the other side, even if there is disagreement on the specifics of executive or other action. What is the reason for the fact that these communications have broken down to the point that we have heads of state in Saudi Arabia and UAE not picking up the US president's phone calls?
Yeah, no, that's a serious issue. I'm honestly at a loss to give you any clear idea about how those relationships should be restructured.
So what we are seeing, substantively speaking, is a series of developments highly destructive for all involved, even though some of the sides are not in agreement that they're not pursuing their own interest. We have seen UAE and Saudi Arabia pursue much closer defense relationships with China, which is arguably a security concern for the US and not necessarily so great for the region either. We have seen Saudis claim that they were left with no choice, with Biden and other previous presidents essentially blocking paths for addressing the defensive needs through the US or its partners. UAE's claims basically that they wish to be respected as a country and don't want to rely on US playing games or be told what to do and who to partner with. Regardless of their motivations, we have seen the outcome. The outcome has been distancing in the relationships between these countries, greater degree of involvement with China. UAE has also made a point of calling Putin not just to discuss bilateral relations, but to make a point that they essentially support the invasion of Ukraine in the middle of a crisis where US on the one hand has played down its own involvement, but on the other hand clearly opposed Russia's position on the matter. So this contradictory, semi non-committal position was not helpful, but at the same time, the signals from these allies in shifting away from the US have been very clear and not particularly positive. What happens next? How far can this go? Can there be a restoration once your partners basically make hostile moves or perceive you as making a hostile move?
I think that any functional relationship can be resuscitated. I don't think that that's the problem. My issue here is that I don't see the willpower on the US side to make a regional investment that the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Israelis and the Jordanians will seriously consider as a clear return of the United States to the Middle East. And there are several reasons for this, but it sort of goes back to the isolationism that I was discussing earlier. I don't, and the sort of weak character that Biden has, the lack of charisma that he has, on these kinds of subjects. I don't foresee the United States building another military base in Saudi Arabia or in the Emirates. I don't see them restructuring an F-35 deal with Saudi Arabia. I don't see those things happening. And when the United States is not being an active player in the region, the Israel-Sunni alliance needs to be in a functional position where it can deal with its security concerns in the region. And so they're going to look for other partners. I think that at a fundamental level, all of the countries in that alliance would prefer an active United States in the region than to try and negotiate deals with China and Russia, primarily because they're familiar with the United States military equipment. They have a long history of using United States-made defense technologies, and the United States military is the largest military on the planet. But just having a gigantic military in Washington, D.C. is not the same as having a gigantic military that's deployed throughout the world. And it's that lack of active engagement with the Middle East that leaves the Israel-Sunni alliance high and dry and promotes their need for alternative partners who are willing to invest in the region. Unfortunately, those partners have aims that are geopolitically opposite those of the United States. And so the Israel-Sunni alliance has tried to balance those new relationships with its historic relationships.
So on the one hand, we are seeing this deterioration with the US specifically. On the other hand, there were supposed to be mechanisms placed that were supposed to preserve some sort of a diplomatic unity. The Abraham Accords, for instance, were not only supposed to integrate Israel into some of the dealings with these states, and not only supposed to present a common defense front against Iran, but they were also supposed to kind of ease US from the most active role in the region without sacrificing its relationships with these allies. It was supposed to be the mediating entity and preserve its influence in that way. To what extent do you think that has actually fulfilled its function, and to what extent has it been, undermined by these other issues that we've discussed?
I think that as a functional matter, Israel has come into a closer rapprochement with UAE than any could have predicted possible, let's say 5 years ago. The Abraham Accords, while they have been touted as a victory of the Trump administration, and perhaps we can say that they are, I think have a lot more to do with the UAE and Bahrain being worried about the United States withdrawal from the region that they saw under Trump, and that they had, and the antagonism that they had seen from Obama. So I think that to the extent that they were trying to feed an alliance between the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia on one side, and Israel, Jordan on the other side, I think that that has been largely achieved. Saudi Arabia hasn't recognized Israel, and but functionally, their intelligence operatives have been seen together in public. They've done joint high-level discussions. The only thing that Saudi Arabia hasn't done is given official recognition, but there's clearly arrangements that Saudi Arabia has with Israeli officials. And so if the point is that we needed to facilitate the relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, well, that's been achieved. The problem is that the United States has achieved it by failing to live up to its role as a mediator and guarantor under that relationship. Right, it's more of salutary neglect than anything else. But any child who's been neglected knows that it doesn't breed a lot of support and appreciation for the parents.
So while the US has been failing in its duties, Israel has actually increased its global influence to the extent that it's now being asked to mediate a major conflict. And we are also seeing simultaneously Turkey attempt to play a role of a mediator after just being recently involved in many tensions of its own, which is quite a drastic change almost overnight. How do you explain these developments, and where do you see all of it going?
I think this is actually a great move for Israel. One of the difficulties that Israel has had to deal with over the course of its 70+ year history is that a lot of the countries of the world don't respect Israel as another country that can perform active diplomatic opportunities. If we look, for example, at the United Nations, Israel is not a member of the Asia group. They're the member of the Western European and others group because the Asian groups would not admit them, right? And so this is a diplomatic coup for Israel to be in a position where they're negotiating with what is effectively a great power as the intermediary party. And it really establishes Israel as an accepted player in the region in much the same way that the Abraham Accords had begun to do, right? If more countries in the region accept Israel, are willing to deal with Israel, treat Israel as a functional member of the Middle East, then Israel becomes a functional member of the Middle East from just a diplomatic perspective and a reality perspective. So this is a great move, but and I'm very happy that Israel has this kind of international recognition, but we should realize where this comes from. This comes from two major things. The first is that the United States has left the Middle East, generally speaking, because otherwise Israel would have condemned the Ukraine invasion, just as the United States has done. Israel has parroted almost every major political position the United States has had until these last, let's say, 3 years. So Israel would have done that and therefore would not have been seen as an objective party by the Russians. But they didn't because of the United States withdrawal. And we also can see that the reason Israel was picked is that Israel has the highest Russian population outside of the former Soviet Union, right? So they have that cultural expertise as well.
So interestingly enough, Russia itself has not been particularly positive for the Middle East. We know the history of the former Soviet Union sponsoring liberation movements that have led to horrendous ethnic issues without actually doing anything for the allegedly aggrieved groups. Whatever it has caused tremendous divisions overall and continues to do so in Syria, where on the one hand it allows Israel to target Iranian sites, but on the other hand it's building the Iranian nuclear reactor and overall supporting Iranian presence in Syria, causing the very problem that Israel then needs it to allow it to help solve at least partially. Is there a long-term solution for getting Russia out of this group on the sphere of influence? However caused that we can blame Obama, we can blame Trump for not doing enough, we can blame all these other people, it's irrelevant in terms of the future.
Sure.
The future is still open, and the future shows that this problem needs to be dealt with sooner rather than later, because nobody wants to be dependent on Russia and have it hijack foreign policy decisions for Israel or for anybody else. So what do you think, who would be that actor to take on the situation, or combination of actors, or an alliance, or a bloc?
Sure.
What could be done?
My first inclination would be the United States, but for the reasons that we've discussed, let's say the United States is not a viable possibility. The only other possibilities I could consider would be some sort of European Union / NATO group. But we've seen from a lot of the European leaders a real reticence to expand their militaries beyond their borders. And for those who are familiar with the German military, until about last year, reports had continually come in about the horrible state of the German military. We're talking about airplanes that are rusting on the tarmac, technology that is over 30 years old. And there's a reason for that, right? Germany has still a certain degree of shell shock and difficulty coming to terms with what the Nazi regime did during World War II. And while that is understandable from a cultural perspective, it's not understandable from a military perspective, certainly from the most powerful single country on the European continent, aside from perhaps Russia. So the lack of willingness on the EU's front to be a military engagement vehicle, as opposed to just an economic free market, an economic single market, in my view, shows the EU is not likely to push Russia out. China is another possible candidate, but I also don't really see China taking actions to push Russia out. First of all, they're quite strong allies. And if not, and it depends on what day of the week, what word they're using to define their relationship, but it's either an alliance or strong cooperation or some word along those lines. So I don't think that China would take an antagonistic view towards Russia. And secondly, China is only just beginning to stretch its arms outside of its sphere of influence, which are the countries that border it. So I don't really see China playing a role here. I also don't see any developing country cooperative being powerful enough to push Russia out. So unless there's aliens landing from Mars, I don't really see any way that Russia would be removed from the region. And furthermore, Iran's relationship with Russia is very helpful to Iran. So I don't see Iran operating in its territories like its proxy territories like Syria, like Iraq, to push out the Iranians. I just don't see it happening in any way. And if Israel were to use its military to defeat the Syrian military, which is entirely possible, they can't defeat the Russians, but they could defeat the Syrians. From that moment, every Arab country in the Israel-Sunni alliance would have to abandon Israel, because whatever Israel does, militarily speaking, it flies in the face of Arab nationalism, and it would be deeply unpopular.
Well, that's my next point in question. The so-called pan-Arabism or Arab nationalism has been giving way thanks to specific initiatives by the leaders of some of these countries, from Egypt to Saudi Arabia, to kind of more country-specific nation-state nationalism, more familiar to Western countries. Do you think that will eventually displace this emotional, cultural, and not really logical reaction to kind of uniting with countries that have entirely different culture? Gulf culture not only is diverse itself, but it's very different from Levantine culture, for instance. Do you see that displacement ever taking place, more or less final?
I agree with you that Arab culture is as useless of a particularized term as European culture or East Asian culture. And we don't use these terms for very obvious reasons. Europeans and East Asians don't see eye to eye within those regions. And I think that increasingly Arabs are going to come to that sort of consensus that Arab culture is as useless, is just a historical connection that they have. But at the same time, I don't see that meaning that it would recede in sort of the public consciousness. And there's a few reasons for that. I think that Arab nationalism draws on a lot of the religious subtext of the Islamic Ummah or Islamic nation. That has been a huge part of Islamic culture for thousands of years, 1,400 years. And while the mobilization of the Ummah as a socio-national concept was a 20th century phenomenon, in much the same way that Zionism in the late 19th century, early 20th century capitalized on the Am Yisrael, Jewish national concept. I think that the roots of these two concepts within their religious traditions are so old that they form a locus of identity for many of these people. So I don't foresee Arab nationalism as a personal feeling ever going away. I see as a national impulse it going away. And I'd be very interested to see actually if Sisi actually drops the Arab from Egypt, the Arab Republic of Egypt. I personally think it's a long time coming, and I think that Egyptians should have a country that recognizes that most Egyptians are not Arabs. They've been Arabized, but genetically speaking, historically speaking, they're not Arabs. And I think that the Egyptian state should recognize that the diversity of the Egyptian population. But if Sisi, who's trying to remove this Arab nationalism, can't even be bothered to change the name of the country, at a political level, I would also say that it's quite difficult to touch as well.
Now, speaking of Sisi and Egypt, there's been an interesting phenomenon where Egypt, while having not fully taken an official position on the Russia invasion of Ukraine, the sentiments coming from the people close to the ruling circles have expressed a disdain for identifying with Russia on the basis of the historical relations, because they recognize that the roots of the current government were close to Nasserism, which went against the dominant ideology. Today caused a great deal of historical damage, and Russia has also failed to support Egypt on its primary security concerns, which was the GRD in Ethiopia most recently. How do you see, much has been said about the outrage over UAE's reaction to Putin and whatever in the US political circles, but much more interesting than that fairly well covered issue is the direction of this issue in the Gulf and between Gulf countries and Egypt. Qatar arguably is the closest to out of all the countries to Russia, having invested $11 billion in its energy sector, among other things, having coordinated a lot of the energy kind of cartel policy. But UAE has considered itself fairly close. They've done a lot. They've been purchasing increasing number of weapons. Egypt has been distancing itself from Russia, contrary to the more historic relationship. Saudi Arabia has been mixed. It has reluctantly dealt with Russia when it had to, but appears to be at least somewhat open to taking action against it in exchange for things that have been promised by the Biden administration. How do you see these issues playing out between those countries? Do you think there's going to be kind of an undercurrent of a conflict and tension on the basis of these dynamics?
Honestly, I would say no. I think that they know that they need to maintain their position in the Middle East vis-a-vis Iran, and to the extent that Russia empowers the Iranian-backed alliance, right? That's Iran, Iraq, Syria, and to a strong degree Lebanon. If that becomes something that jeopardizes the Israel-Sunni alliance, then there might be some shouting between the countries that didn't stand by Russia and those that do because of Russia's increasing threat. And conversely, if Russia makes some grand overture that gives the Israel-Sunni alliance some sort of victory, which is incredibly impossible, but the 1 in 3 billion chance, then there might be shouting in the other direction. But I don't think that Russia is intent on changing anything in the status quo within the Iranian state and their proxies. So I don't really see it as a point that's going to cause a lot of friction between the members of the Israel-Sunni alliance.
Now, getting back to the energy aspect of this whole situation, we have seen the havoc that was wreaked by a mixture of really poorly thought out European policies, Russia's ability to take advantage of that, Qatar's also focus on achieving energy dominance, and this strange dynamic between these states, which has seen Qatar and Russia grow increasingly close to the disadvantage of everybody else, and the current standoff over supply. Biden's policy response to all of this has been bizarre. Biden has closed down U.S. pipelines, rejected Saudi Arabia initially. Now he attempted to get Qatar to increase supply. It hasn't worked out for logistical and other reasons. Now he's going to Venezuela while also trying to get Saudi Arabia to cut Russian oil and increase supply. What's going on with all of that? It seems to be rather inconsistent, especially given that he is also claiming that he wants to flood the market with cheap Iranian oil. How does he expect Saudi Arabia and others to play ball when he's literally giving an opportunity to their competitor and enemy? I mean, what's the thinking here?
I don't think that Biden is thinking from an external perspective. I think he's thinking from a very domestic American perspective. So one of the chief indicators, if you look at election history, for which party would win post 1950 or so, is the price of oil, because of the prominence of the automobile in the United States. And so he wants to make sure that the price of oil per barrel stays quite low, at least $80 a barrel or less, because otherwise the price of gas at the pump is going to motivate Americans in the midterms to vote against Democratic candidates in their area. This is, of course, despite the fact that this was a bipartisan bill, and therefore and a bipartisan sanctions against Russia, that led to this lack of oil in the market. Regardless, he needs to get oil prices down. At the same time, he has domestic commitments to environmentalist groups on the left side of the spectrum to prevent the drilling of oil in the shale deposits that exist within the United States and Canada. So he's sort of locked into his own pretzel of he needs to get the oil prices down, but he's removed the greatest supplier from the market. He can't invest domestically in countering the issue. So he needs to go to countries that would produce oil. And he just sent out, an RSVP to everybody on the market. Well, that's not the way that you do it if you're trying to do it intelligently. What you do intelligently is you say, look, okay, we have this environmental concern. It's an important environmental concern, but right now we have a geostrategic threat. And so we can revisit that later. Let's extract the oil from the shale deposits. And also let's go to our allies first in order to have them make more money on the market being flooded. But that's not what the Biden administration did.
So let's be honest with ourselves. All presidents, no matter what party, ideology, and personality, do contradictory and unrealistic election promises, which they sometimes then reconsider in light of reality and changing circumstances. Why has Biden remained so committed to these environmental groups, which may have relatively limited impact down the road, when he has the elections coming up and when other complications, including the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Iranian deal, and so forth, have clearly pushed matters into a much more critical direction? Where's this motivation not to do the simple, obvious things first?
I don't know exactly why he wants to stop drilling in the shale deposits. My intuition here is that he's afraid of losing the progressive members of his party within the Senate and within the House, because he needs those votes if he wants any of his bills to pass, many of which are more conservative in their alignment. So I think that it's trying to thread the needle there, right? It goes back to that organizational theory of you're trying to please all the cooks in the kitchen, and so you come up with a pastiche policy that doesn't work, because it doesn't achieve any of the aims that any of the individual policies would have really been able to achieve.
Well, both parties in the US have always comprised of very diverse factions and wings and interests. It's the job of the president and his liaisons and the whip in Congress to make sure that everyone lines up, no matter where they usually stand on key issues, even if they differ, and cut deals with each other over less important, mutually beneficial bills. Where have we reached the point that that has become impossible? Is it just the weakness of the current administration and its inability to talk to people? Is it the extreme ideological divides within the party? And if so, why is it more extreme than before when some of these people were always there? Um,
Yeah.
what's happening?
I actually disagree with the supposition of the question. One of the things that we've seen traditionally in the United States is that the relationship between the three branches of government has not been consistent and historically has differed, right? If we look, for example, in the 19th century, the dominant power in the United States was not the president, it was the Senate. And so the people that were the most outspoken were the senators, right? You had Webster, Clay, Calhoun, and the debates between them were what really defined American policy. The consolidation of power within the president has been an increasingly 20th century and 21st century phenomenon. But in order for that to work, you need to have a president who's powerful enough to actually control the debate. And I don't think Biden is that person. So I think you're sort of having a rudderless legislature because they've lost that ability. They're very afraid of basically being called out on their votes. So they don't do anything, but they do have their priorities, and so they can withhold voting on a bill that they might find particularly egregious. So I think that's why you're seeing the sort of confusion in terms of policy that you have here.
We have also seen a very bizarre dynamic in Biden's attempt to get the allies to pony up what he's asking from them, which is to get the prices on the gas jump by flooding the market with their own oil, while simultaneously, promising Iranian oil. Right? I mean, he has initially rejected going to them, then he had sent Macron to negotiate, then he sent a coterie of assorted activists claiming that Saudi Arabia and OPEC have a responsibility to prevent, the Ukraine crisis and save lives by, getting killing off Russian oil and so forth. All of that has been remarkably obtuse in terms of negotiation, extremely public, and backfired to the point that no one wants to talk to him right now. And Biden went, of all countries, to Venezuela, which is close to both Russia and Iran, and has generated a lot of pushback from a lot of people. How do you imagine this playing out? Can he salvage the situation? And why would anyone let it get to the point of this completely incomprehensible strategy? Let's say, fine, he's trying to manage too many different parties to begin with, but why would he communicate it in a way that was bound to not end well?
This to me looks like a problem for Blinken. I don't. He's a veteran of U.S. politics. I don't know why he's the Secretary of State. I don't know why he would be running an operation this shoddy. Not having the U.S. president negotiate with the president of Russia, that would have been pretty much any diplomat's, round one would be, because the seriousness of the issue necessitates presidential presence. And by not being there in person, he showed how little he cared about the situation, because you send secondaries in situations that are not as important, right? This is diplomacy 101. So I don't know what Blinken was thinking here. I'm genuinely surprised, because this is usually not his style.
Do you think there were other actors involved who pushed that particular policy? We've seen US make certain commitments regarding the Russia-Ukraine situation, then under pressure from Europe and others, go back and continuously revise this whole thing, and it looks messy. It would have been better not to make such clear commitments to begin with and leave strategic ambiguity on U.S. course of action that would have at least allowed U.S. to maneuver without looking foolish. Why is this administration so intent on making rigid pronouncements than it later has to dispense with?
I think that's more of a comment on Biden's character. He tends to be a very direct person, and he tends to say things that are better left unsaid. So yeah, I think that really comes down to Biden's character. He wants to make those pronouncements because he feels like that's his source of strength, as opposed to a source of strength being a commanding presence, which he just doesn't have. Maybe he had it 40 years ago. I've seen tape of him from the 70s. It's not really that promising. But part of being a president is actually being a leader, and that's making those decisions about how much to disclose and how much to leave open.
So this raises the final question, which I would like to kind of wrap all of this up with, because there's a lot going on. That's the question of leadership. A lot has been said about the leadership of President Zelensky in Ukraine, especially by contrast to President Putin. Much less has been said about the leadership of everyone else, the secondary players in this current events. What's your assessment? Does a particular leadership really have to play a role? Can the system compensate for lack of a very strong head of state presence? And what are we and given that Biden is not likely to go anywhere for the next 2 years at least, what can US do to compensate for this lack of executive leadership?
Sure. I actually want to comment on Zelensky first, because this is something that I don't think a lot of people talk about. To me, the Russian invasion of Ukraine looks very similar to the US invasion of Iraq, where you have a president who declares that a nation is engaging in behavior that is demonstrably false by the evidence, expects when he arrives to receive a population that would be adoring him and supporting the removal of the tyrannical power, finds that the population is not that way and begins resisting. My intuition is that Zelensky has properly framed himself as the militant leader of the Ukrainian resistance army, right? Or the Ukrainian Republican Army. Like use your European euphemism for the IRA, for whatever phalangist force you want. And that's why he shows up in military fatigues. He walks in bunkers. He speaks in punctuated, simple sentences, because he's going for that image. And he's done an excellent job. I think military tacticians will study this for generations, and propagandists will study this for generations, how he has managed to create an image for himself that places him squarely within a heroic parameter. To be fair, he is coordinating a number of militias across Ukraine, but he's done far less than a lot of other war leaders who are not as famous have done, right? How many people remember, I'm trying to think of, like, the leaders of Norway during World War II, right? During the first couple weeks of Nazi invasion before Norway fell, we've seen other war leaders who've gone through similar circumstances that people don't remember, and it's because
I would kind of argue that point a little bit, because what he has not done in terms of direct military participation, he has compensated for exceptional lobbying that has literally turned around a number of countries on a number of vital issues.
Oh no! Oh, absolutely.
Which is not necessarily the case with the countries that you mentioned. In fact, it's just different. I would say it's like comparing apples to oranges in terms of the way they choose to deal with the situation. Just different approaches entirely.
But I would say the popularity of Zelensky in the public square It's very little to do with those backdoor dealings.
Mhm,
But I think your question was, how do we
mhm.
see among third-party players, what do their governments do? How do we maintain diplomatic ties? How do we begin to create alliances and foment relationships? And the functional view, it would be in my part, either in the Ukraine scenario or in the Middle East itself, for the United States to reassert itself, either militarily, or if barring that, to support an insurgent group in Ukraine, or with more than just providing weapons. We're talking about providing personnel, providing assistance, individuals who can help guide these developments, similar to the 2000 U.S. soldiers that are in certain parts of Syria or Iraq, who give tactical advice. That, I think, that would show a certain degree of U.S. commitment. I think also letting the State Departments and other organizations of the deep state actually do the work that they do, and build back those relationships at at the back channels, so that way we can get to the front channels where people are finally being able to recognize each other. So you really have to build the relationships from ground zero if they're not working.
Do you think Biden has the humility to recognize that, given where it has come? And here's the weird thing: just recently there was a leak that he was planning to visit Saudi Arabia in person, and now we're talking about the leaders of that country not picking up the phone. I mean, what is actually happening with that policy? What is he actually intending to do?
I don't think he knows. That's I mean, that's the thing, is that I think that he doesn't have any coherent policy. I think his policy is just the pastiche of everybody around him. So I don't know. I think if this is the thoughts of Biden's own mind, then he's approaching Saudi Arabia the way you do a neighbor, right? You call up your neighbor doesn't answer the phone. Oh, well, I'll just knock on the door, see if he's home. That's not how foreign relations works. That's not how state visits work. State visits require a lot of coordination between the host country and the visitor. You don't just show up, and you certainly don't show up after your phone call has been rejected, because the phone call is a lower level meeting that might precipitate an in-person meeting, but it's not. It shows a clear lack of understanding of how diplomacy works.
Interestingly, I think it is worth noting on that note that Saudi Arabia has not, in fact, closed all the doors for communications, because they've signaled willingness to do certain things in exchange for other expectations that had previously been unfulfilled. And they had, at the end of the day, not gone out of the way to show complete move to Russia's side in that sense. So it sounds to me like there's a signal kind of encouraging a communication, but for whatever reason, the Biden administration, and not just Biden himself, but the team, seems unable to interpret the signals and to react to them in a mature, thoughtful way. I feel like there's a lot of very adolescent emotional dynamic, almost like trying to chase after somebody and then playing hard to get in a way that's not very appropriate.
I like the metaphor. I'm not 100% sure if I agree, but I do like the pretty picture of Biden running around trying to skirt chase. So yeah, I think that's a fun picture to leave off on.
Well, let's hope that the heads of state will figure it out. It's their job. We're here to discuss it from the sidelines. But thank you for this really thoughtful and interesting remarks. They actually made me stop and think about a lot of things from a very different perspective, different angle. Admittedly, a lot of it is not really being fully addressed or discussed in the media, which has been reduced to a very familiar set of talking points on both sides and not really much nuance or different kind of out of the box thinking. So thank you for doing that, and it's been a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Irina. And as I mentioned, for those of you who are listening, I do a series every Thursday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Time that deals in Middle Eastern Islamic history. And we are actually doing our 29th episode tonight. On Thursday night, and it's going to be on Napoleon and Muhammad Ali in Egypt. It's really a very interesting moment, similar to what we were talking about today. It's about the functional change of organization within the Egyptian deep state, for want of a better term, and how Egypt entered a modernization period. You can access it by going to Meetup and going to New York Culture and Events, and it should be there. It's a Zoom at that point, and then you'll be able to ask me questions or just listen in.
And Richard, thank you. If you can send me that information, I will also share it on social media when I also share the YouTube link to this discussion. That way, that whoever hasn't had a chance to view the whole thing would be able to see that information quickly.
Thank you so much, Irina. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and I'll see you around.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Stay tuned for our next event next week, same time, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio Tuesday nights. Thank you all, and have